Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and thanks so much for being with us for this webinar with David Rohde. His book just came out. He is the executive editor of NewYorker.com, and his book is In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. David Rohde, as I mentioned, is executive editor of the New Yorker. And during his career, he has been with New York Times, the Christian Science Monitor, and Reuters. In 1996, he received one of his two Pulitzers for the reporting he did in Bosnia. And he also received the other Pulitzer for work that he did covering the war in Afghanistan, as well as the situation in Pakistan. Richard Schaefer, he's a good friend. He's been in Dallas for a few years now, longtime journalist, Forbes, Fortune, New York Times, but I think the Wall Street Journal's blood is still coursing through his veins, where he was for a number of years. Before moving to Texas, he managed the private capital markets division of Dow Jones and Company and advised institutional investors about technology for the world's poorest. So we got a great lineup today. Richard, I'll turn it over to you, and I look forward to listening to the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. David, glad to be with you. I've enjoyed your book, but before I get to it, let's talk about you. I want to talk about your career and you as a person. As Jim mentioned, you've won many journalism awards, including 2 Pulitzers. Although I must point out, you have yet to win a single Nobel Prize. Shortly after college, you joined the Christian Science Monitor and soon became its man in the Balkans. That's because you spoke Croatian, right, or Serbian?
No, I didn't speak any of those languages. I was just an ambitious young journalist, is the honest answer. And thank you, Jim, for that very kind introduction.
So you've been described as a modest guy, boarding school, Ivy League grad, given to proper blue shirts and unassuming glasses. What our viewers may not know is, because it isn't in the book, something happened back in 2008. Shortly after your marriage, while in Afghanistan doing research for a book.
You're going for the jugular here with it. It was, yeah. After many years of reporting overseas, I got married in September of 2008. I was finishing a book about the U.S. Intervention in Afghanistan, what had gone wrong there. And about 2 months after I got married, in literally one of the last interviews for the book, I was in Afghanistan. I went and interviewed a Taliban commander. He had done interviews with a couple of European journalists. I met with one of them. She was French. She said, well, he treated me fine, and I think he probably just wants to get his message across to you. You're in more danger as an American, but, she said, I'll be okay. I went to the interview and he immediately kidnapped me and 2 of my Afghan colleagues. We were held captive for 7 months. And I was able to escape with the help of the Afghan journalist who was kidnapped with me.
So I told my wife about that, and she said, wait a minute, don't you ever do that. What did your wife say? What did your family say?
That's what my wife said. Yeah, the joke was that I was sort of the worst newlywed husband ever, but which is still true, I think. It's not funny to joke about. It was a horrible time. I considered it and still consider it a kind of criminal act. It was the same Taliban faction that actually held the U.S. soldier Bo Bergdahl for 5 years. They held an American, a professor who was teaching in Kabul. They kidnapped him. Kevin King is his name. He was held for 3 years. He was just released. He was just released as part of the ongoing peace process there. So it was a terrible ordeal, harder in some ways for my family. I had a sense they wanted to hold on to me and try to get some big ransom. But it was just torture for my new wife and my parents and siblings and friends.
So not only did you find a rope hidden under a pile of stuff and manage to somehow get over a 15-foot wall, you write later on that you suggested at one point, in order to save your Afghan colleagues, you suggested that your Taliban captor cut off one of your fingers. Now, there is no anesthetic around. There is no analgesic, no anesthesia. What were you thinking? I mean, it was some amazing offer.
Well, I felt a terrible amount of guilt. My ambition to make the big book about what went wrong in Afghanistan led me to go to this interview. And then there had been a kidnapping of an Italian journalist a couple months before us. And the tactic the Taliban used was that they would take the driver, the Afghan driver, and execute him. They beheaded that driver in that case and videotaped it. And they would use these videotapes as a way to pressure the foreigners, families and governments. You know, again, that was an Italian, and obviously I'm American, to produce the ransom they demanded. They were asking for $25 million in cash for me, and the number varied 8, 10, or 12 prisoners from Guantanamo. And so and it's the last simple thing is, kidnapping, it was terrible, but it's also similar to what folks go through all the time. And I would say it's sort of like being diagnosed with cancer or any potentially terminal illness. You're forced to kind of realize you don't control your fate. You kind of go into you think very carefully about every decision you make, and you have to confront your mortality. And I just felt like I'd regret it for the rrest of my life if his name was Assad Mangal. He's alive. He's in the United States. Was beheaded, and died, and his family. So that's why I, made that offer.
Well, I think it says a lot about you. Let's move on to your book. In Deep offers us what you say is the truth about America's deep state. Is deep state, help me understand, is it more than just some kind of vague pejorative term that's used to discredit people? And if it's something more than that, how does it differ from what I used to know as the military industrial complex or the establishment or the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants? What is it?
So there all the things. There is an American establishment. I'm a member of it. I'm a mainstream journalist, the New Yorker, the New York Times, Reuters. And that all exists. But, the quick summary of my investigation was that I do think I did not find evidence of a organized, political conspiracy to undermine President Trump or overthrow him. He's used the term coup. So we have an establishment. We have the CIA and the FBI are very dangerous. They're very powerful. They need to be organized very carefully. Every president that's come to office has complained about the bureaucrats in Washington. Ronald Reagan thought State Department diplomats were too liberal and weren't carrying out his, agenda against communism. Barack Obama thought the generals in the Pentagon were releasing troop numbers to try to box him in to do a big troop surge in Afghanistan. But no president has accused, career government officials of a coup. And I, conclude, I don't like the term deep state, and I think it's political rhetoric. On the left, you'd say good government or public servants, or statesmen or stateswomen. So, if you like government, you use good government. And if you don't like government, you talk about the swamp or the deep state.
Well, the president calls the swamp, and yet you concentrate not on, I think of the swamp as, the guy who stamps my passport or somebody who is at the motor vehicles department, but you concentrate on the highest levels of intelligence, national security, and the justice community. Why that particular focus?
Well, they've committed abuses in the past, and they've had a checkered history, particularly during the Cold War. And then, I started this book because you've mentioned that the different ways people view it. But in 2018, there was a poll that said that I think it was more than 70% of Americans feel that there's a group of unelected officials and military officers who secretly influence government policy in Washington. 8 in 10 Americans, according to that poll, felt they were being surveilled by their own government. But there is a different terms people use. So liberals tend to talk about the military-industrial complex, as you mentioned, a cabal of generals and defense contracting firms that push us into endless wars. And then conservatives, the term they use, and I think it's a fine term, is the administrative state. And that's an ever-growing government that, conservatives feel, is constantly encroaching in our lives and making decisions for us and taking away our civil liberties.
So we mentioned people think about this group and that it exists. Do they trust this unelected group, or do they distrust it generally?
They distrusted it. And the interesting thing about the poll was that the two groups that had the highest likelihood of fearing that there was a deep state, on one side was racial minorities. And you could see how African Americans, given, there's decades of complaints about the criminal justice system and uneven sentencing based on race. The FBI famously and horribly wiretapped and tried to smear Martin Luther King, they, were very understandably suspicious. And then among conservatives, it was NRA members that were the highest percentage to say they feared a deep state, and that could be obviously their fear of taking away their right to bear arms.
You mentioned in one part of the book these two old BBC comedies from the 80s, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, in which the permanent secretaries of departments actually hold the power. And you suggest that similar situations actually are the case in France and Germany. Is this the most powerful group in the US, or is something different going on here?
They shouldn't be, and I'm trying to be fair here, and President Trump and his supporters are right that he is the elected leader of this country. There are elections, held every 2, 4, 6 years. And those presidents and members of Congress have a mandate to carry out specific policies. And so, unless an order from President Trump is illegal, government servants, career government servants should carry it out. And he's right about that. But again, I talked to all these civil servants, and they said there's all kinds of very strict oversight of them. There's congressional investigations if they do anything improper. There's the Hatch Act, which bars them from engaging in any kind of political activity. There's inspectors general looking at all their work. And, one of the main characters in the book, her name was Joan Dempsey. She was a career intelligence official. She worked in the Navy, then in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then was the number 3 official in the CIA. And she said, look, there's lazy government officials. There's some who are politically biased that might slow roll a new program. But she did not see sort of widespread defiance of these rules. The people who work in government, she said, are very cautious. And she called them sort of competent do-gooders. And I know many people just sneer at or laugh at that idea, but that's what I heard from many of these folks I interviewed.
So you interviewed a lot of people, and you looked carefully into this whole question. It's not a question of sort of slow rolling or trying to protect your budget and so forth, but the allegations go beyond that. Are civil servants, in fact, trying to thwart the Trump administration? Are they actually undermining or trying to, as opposed to just residing over policy differences?
So the book starts with, it's in the first few weeks of the Trump administration, and I had a government official, a source I knew, who contacted me and said they wanted to talk, and I met the person, and they had heard about the details of President Trump's first call from the Oval Office with Vladimir Putin, the head of Russia. And, it was not that Trump talked about, some secret plot for the election, but this government official was troubled because the conversation didn't go well. Putin raised the sort of main nuclear arms agreement between the U.S. and Russia, and Trump didn't seem to, recognize the name of it or what it was. And he asked his aides for a question. And then, according to what this first official had learned, much of the rest of the conversation was Trump sort of bragging about the size of the crowd at the inauguration. So this person saw themselves as a whistleblower, that they felt that this wasn't classified information that was going to endanger American troops or American lives. This was to them a warning about how the president was performing. And there was a whole series of leaks at that point about these phone calls. There was one where he got in a shouting match with the Prime Minister of Australia, shouting match with the President of Mexico. And it infuriated the Trump administration. And it started this deep suspicion that I think the president has, that he can't trust anyone who's around him. They're all gonna leak and make him look bad. We asked Sean Spicer for comment. He said the president asked that question because he was asking for the advice of an aide. It wasn't that he didn't recognize the name of the nuclear arms treaty. And I ran that story. And I'm biased. I believe in transparency. Leaks about Republicans, leaks about Democrats that don't endanger people. It's fine to do. And this was politically embarrassing. But anyway, the point was they launched a criminal leak investigation into all these leaks about these phone calls. My source was very afraid he was going to, go to jail, and it's continued since then. But that's the question: is he plotting politically to undermine the president, or is he a whistleblower? It depends on your political persuasion.
Well, regardless of what he thinks about any particular individual in the administration, not in the administration, but in the government, does he believe in the concept of politically neutral intelligence agencies or nonpartisan government employees, or do you think he just thinks that doesn't exist in public service? There is no nonpartisan public service.
Yeah, and I want to. I did not interview the president. I talked to current and former administration officials. I get the sense, based on his remarks, that I think we're all products of our background, and Donald Trump comes out of a viciously competitive New York real estate world, and there's a tendency in the New York real estate world that everybody has an angle. Everybody's exaggerating a little bit. Everybody's trying to get their percent of a deal. So I get the sense he's very skeptical of the idea that he sits down for his daily intelligence briefing and it's just the facts. He's obviously very skeptical of news reports, but I think that's maybe part of the way he sees things. Maybe his time in government is changing that. Look at, the coronavirus right now. He has been generally supportive of Dr. Tony Fauci. There's been Trump supporters that have attacked Fauci and said he exaggerated the need for the shutdown of the economy, but it's reassuring. Maybe he's getting more supportive or more trusting of Fauci. For our government to function, we have to trust certain experts, certain health experts, as we see today. And if we can't do that, I don't know how we can agree on sort of basic facts and basic policies to deal with a crisis like this.
Yeah, a question I want to mention that we take questions and so forth, but let me ask about one here. Can you touch on the recent firing of the intelligence IG Michael Atkinson and how that reflects on the president's opinion of the intelligence community?
So Atkinson was the inspector general who shared the. He followed all the proper procedures. He did not break any laws, but he deemed the whistleblower complaint about Ukraine that led to the president's impeachment to be a credible and significant complaint, and that moved that forward, which ended up it arriving in Congress and Democrats learning about it, and that there's a sense that if you challenge this president or if you question his views, another example would be Dan Coates, the former director of national intelligence.
Yes.
In a congressional hearing, in this annual hearing about worldwide threats, asked by a senator, he said. Dan Coates said that the intelligence community assessed that Kim Jong-un was, highly unlikely to give up his nuclear weapons. The president, tweeted that was just wrong and that, Coates needed to go back to school. Coates was eventually forced out. He's left now. And the president has appointed a member of Congress to replace him, who's a strong supporter of the president's. And I am forgetting his name right now, the Texas congressman, who he sort of grilled Robert Mueller during the Mueller hearings, and the idea is that Trump is putting loyalists into these positions, and that people, instead of giving neutral judgments of the facts and what's happening in the world, the president wants people who are going to echo his political talking points.
Just
Representative John Ratcliffe. I got it. There we go.
Along that line, with the changing of administration personnel, I did a Google search on the words just at random. Trump fired, Obama fired, and Bush fired. And the Bush search turned up 844 results, Obama 2,180, and Trump 71,200. What does that tell us about the difference in presidential approaches?
Well, it's, a president has a right to sort of, fire officials. I do think that there is a sense among officials that there is less testimony now. So Gina Haspel, the director of the CIA, Chris Wray, the director of the FBI, we haven't had a worldwide threats hearing yet in Congress. They happen every January. And what's happened is that there's a sense, and I didn't speak with Haspel or Wray, but I spoke to people in both organizations. There's a sense that you keep your head down. You don't sort of say things in public. If you're a member of the administration, that'll get you in a public fight with the president. And that's the best way to defend the institutions. Just keep your nose down. Gina Haspel, as you see here on the screen, protect the country, collect intelligence. Chris Wray, same thing for the FBI. Arrest people around the country and do your job and not get in the political fight. The flip side of that is that we are approaching, the president's re-election and a decisive. Anyway, it's 4 years are up, and our top experts are speaking less publicly. That's troubling to me as a journalist. I'm biased. I want transparency. I want hearings. So it has silenced some officials, I think, from publicly contradicting something the president says.
Earlier in the administration, though, there were actual calls for bureaucratic resistance. For example, shortly after his inauguration, the Washington Post reported that 180 federal employees signed up for a workshop on civil disobedience. Others were seeking guidance about how to oppose the new administration in slowing down their work. And in some eyes, intelligence law enforcement agencies have turned on the president. For example, the directors of FBI and the CIA have become harsh critics of the president. Former director CIA Director John Brennan once warned that Trump would, when all was known, he would be, this is his quote, he would take his rightful place as a disgraced demagogue in the dustbin of history. How did this change come about?
Well, I spoke to a lot of current FBI and CIA officials, and they actually criticize Brennan and Comey for, Jim Comey, the former FBI director, for being so political after they left office. And I would disagree with the government workers that were taking, or looking for opportunities for how to derail the new administration's agenda. It's everyone has a right to speak. Brennan and obviously Comey do, but these people felt that this positioning was playing into the conspiracy theory about a highly politicized FBI and CIA. I found that the FBI and CIA are divided just like the rest of the country. There's groups of people that, like President Trump, love him. There's groups that don't like him at all. And one specific thing, and we'll talk about this in more detail, there were problems with the FBI's Trump Russia investigation. Carter Page, who was surveilled by the FBI, there was a finding by a very extensive investigation by the Justice Department Inspector General. 2 of the applications to eavesdrop him were proper and legally justified. 2 were not. That's being investigated. I think that's good. It's being investigated. But again, I just want to say, it is wrong, and it's wrong. Carter Page's civil rights were violated. But, there was no wiretap of Trump Tower. The FBI has not carried out a widespread coup to force him from office. Robert Mueller, in the end, said there was not evidence of collusion. That finding helped the president politically. So in some ways, the system, has been working. And again, the talk of a coup, I found is exaggerated.
So speaking of deep state, the president has relied a lot on his own non-governmental assistants and advisors, from Giuliani to his son-in-law Jared Kushner. Some would even say he relies on Sean Hannity. Is President Trump, in effect, creating his own deep state?
I make that point at the end of the book. And I say, whether it's out of fear or calculation, and I think, again, there's this dynamic where he doesn't trust the many of the aides that are around him, many of the permanent government officials. But it is concerning. The president, has blocked all congressional subpoenas to investigate his actions. Unlike President Nixon, he did not cooperate, and President Clinton, he did not cooperate at all in the impeachment investigation. He barred any documents and testimony. So there's sort of less and less transparency. And then with Rudy Giuliani, he was sort of carrying out this sort of a private foreign policy. With Sean Hannity, there's late night phone calls that, they regularly talk to each other, and Hannity sort of operates like a private communications arm of the White House. And it is concerning, and it could be because he doesn't trust anyone, but it is, it's a small cadre of loyalists. There's no public transparency. There's no government norms that apply to Rudy Giuliani. And if the definition of a deep state is a secretive group that's influencing government policy, that's what it is. So ironically, yes, I say at the end of the book, Trump is moving towards creating a deep state of his own. But
every president appoints, as you point out, something like 3,000 people in his administration each time. Once President Trump is no longer president, won't the next person just appoint another 3,000 of his own folks?
They will, and that's what's unusual about the American system. I meant to say this earlier. The British system, yes, British prime ministers appoint a few dozen people to go run each ministry. So an American president has more power to corral and run the federal bureaucracy than other governments. And I guess what's different is that, look, these hearings drive everybody crazy, and there's posturing by Republicans and Democrats. But, the fact that the president is refusing subpoenas and refusing to have his aides testify before Congress, is unusual. Who is visiting the White House? The more transparency, the better for me. So, look, it's not fun for the Secretary of State or the Secretary of the Interior to be called up before Congress, and it seems like it's a circus. But that's our democracy. It's having the different branches compete with each other. They're all trying to score points. Lawsuits are filed. Was that action by the EPA legal or not? And it ends up with the Supreme Court weighing in it in the end. So that's what's critical to me. And I as the president, complains about judges, halting his travel ban temporarily, as he complains about, as he dismisses investigations as witch hunts, the concentration of power, I found is a recipe and a lack of transparency, for abuses and corruption.
So I want to remind viewers that questions are welcome, but while I'm waiting for another question, let me ask you about, you mentioned Carter Page and his rights. Presidential power, as you point out, has long been abused. Like for decades, the FBI and the CIA and the NSA have acted as political spies on Americans. They've lied to Congress. They've carried out secret drone strikes, broken various laws on behalf of the president or his policies. What examples from previous administrations trouble you the most?
I think that what troubled me the most was in the 60s, J. Edgar Hoover was carrying out things on his own. There was many things he was doing. Lyndon Johnson, with the Texas angle, had the FBI wiretap fellow Democrats at the 1964 Democratic Convention. But there are other things that's a great image. Wow. There were other, the CIA was also, they would have verbal conversations with the president about covert action programs. Anyway, this all changes in the 70s with the Church Committee, the investigations they did. John Tower, another Texas politician, was part of that. And since then, since the church reforms, they created the intelligence committees. There was a ban. Anyway, when the president carries out a covert program in another country, it's now a written document that the president must sign. And those covert action findings are then shared with the top members of Congress from both parties. And this was all a way to kind of hold the CIA accountable and hold presidents accountable for what they were doing. And I think the system is much better since those reforms were created in the 70s, because Iran-Contra, which was, the selling of the weapons to Iran and giving the funds to the Contras, that was famously Oliver North. That was, well, who knew what when is still the question, but that was at the behest of the president. That wasn't, the CIA doing it on its own. After 9/11, the eavesdropping, the waterboarding, the tortures, how many people felt it was, that was on the orders of the president. So we have less of a problem now of of the CIA and the FBI sort of doing things completely on their own. The question is, many conservatives felt, when you talk about Bill Barr, he felt that the presidency was weakened after Watergate. It surged back, I think, with power after 9/11, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, who just used presidential power aggressively. But again, this is back to this core issue of the different branches. How powerful should a president be? How much can Congress and the courts challenge what a president wants to do to protect the country in a moment of crisis?
So we talk about branches of government. Let's turn for a moment to the so-called fourth branch of government, the media. You're an executive editor. You're an executive editor of the New Yorker for news online at the New Yorker. Now, I think of that as one of the last bastions of long-form journalism, and yet you have to have news online every day, all the time. How has that changed the New Yorker as a place to be and its mission as you see it?
So that's a great question, and I'm the executive editor for news for the website. There's an executive editor for the magazine who's a great colleague of mine, and who's a much better editor than me and much more senior. So, look, perfect example. Part of the crisis, I think, of American democracy right now is a crisis of journalism. The New Yorker can't survive economically just on print subscriptions. There's less and less advertisers who want to buy a print advertising because young people are reading their news on the web. So we've massively expanded the New Yorker website. We have a digital subscription now where you can just look at the website, and that's the way we're going to survive. And we have to change and innovate and grow for the future. But the crisis is that so many small newspapers are now struggling. There isn't really a model for, a profitable news organization with hundreds or thousands of reporters. And this is my pitch for the media. Look, there's a problem. Fox, MSNBC, CNN. It's the way to survive economically is to go partisan. Conspiracy theory and partisanship, travels faster and longer on air and online than kind of a straight, boring, down the middle piece. And I would just say to folks, if you're let's say you're a conservative and you don't believe anything you see in the mainstream media, and I'm not saying this, Richard Schaefer, because of your history at the Wall Street Journal, but I'd urge conservatives, if you see crazy stuff on Facebook about, Barack Obama wasn't born in the United States and that kind of level of allegation, but it's not appearing on the pages of the Wall Street Journal, it is probably false.
Hey.
Rupert Murdoch owns, I've been saying this in other talks, I'm not just saying it for Richard's sake. Rupert Murdoch owns Fox News and he owns the Wall Street Journal. Clearly, editorially, the Wall Street Journal, the editorial page supports President Trump. So, so if it's true, it would be reported by the Wall Street Journal. What's changed is that, the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, when we run a story, we face libel suits. A lawyer reads our stories. And if we print something that is false or defamatory about something, they can sue us for a lot of money. They could potentially, put us out of business. Facebook, Twitter, Google, under the laws that, govern the internet right now, have no legal liability, responsibility whatsoever. They can print things that smear folks that are completely false, and they have no threat of a lawsuit. And that's a huge problem that needs to change. That was created to help the internet grow. So there's actually stricter standards for what we post in newspapers and on most major news organizations' websites than on Twitter and Facebook. And so be skeptical of journalists. Read the Wall Street Journal if you're conservative, but don't be cynical. There are systems for us to be held accountable. There's thousands of journalists, run around Washington. I've never been instructed by my editor or been part of any plot to kind of intentionally go out and smear folks. Most journalists, do their best, I think, to try to get their stories right. Not opinion columnists, I'm not talking about them, but to try to get it right as best they can and be as fair as best they can in their news stories.
One of the discouraging things to me as a longtime reader of the New Yorker is to see some organizations online which have preceded their stories by saying 3-minute read, 2-minute read, 5-minute read, as if nobody has an attention span anymore. How do you react to that as an online editor?
We don't try to cover everything. We have a whole array of great columnists that kind of try to lucidly analyze what's happening. And then we run very long, in-depth stories. So you either get like the quick, sharp take about what's happening, or you get the long, in-depth, definitive story. And look, people are busy. Maybe they don't have time to read as much. If they want to watch, videos, there's great work online being done on videos. I like the internet. I think it's a great thing. I think we have to change and evolve and tell stories in different ways. It's just this kind of, look, the more partisan you are, the more traffic you get on the internet, period. And that's unfortunate. And so if they'll subscribe and pay subscriptions, it lets us depend less on kind of clicks and traffic. We have a consistent income that helps the news organization grow over time instead of chasing, junk traffic is the term, clickbait, where people are just coming on and seeing something terrible and then, moving on. So subscribe to the news organizations you believe in. That gives us economic stability to be steady and thoughtful and not just, go left or right as a way to get a larger audience.
There's an audience question which reminds me of the olden days, as I call them, back when presidential press conference were summarized and the media just reported what they thought were the highlights and the most significant points. The question is, should the media step back from giving President Trump a national audience every day when some people regard these as simply a substitute for his campaign rallies?
My answer is no. He is the president of the United States, and if he wants to give a press conference, you broadcast it. Let voters watch the press conference and make the decision they want. He could tweet all he wants. That's fine. Look, the Washington Post has been tracking his statements now for 3 years. They're at roughly 15,000 false or misleading statements. They've increased every year. And the country is, among voters is pretty evenly divided. So half the voters feel that the Washington Post is right and the president is lying, more than any other president, more than any politician. And half the country, half of voters roughly support President Trump and think the Washington Post is fake news and making it up. I'm an establishment journalist. I tend to trust the Washington Post and the process they follow. I think, as I've said, the president, has exaggerated the whole deep state thing. But I'm all for, more information, the better. Let president say as much as he wants and broadcast his press conferences.
Can you imagine being the person who has to check out the president's tweets? There's a job in journalism, 16,000 a year.
It's a whole team that the Post has put together, and it's several reporters, and they write it up, and there's I'm an editor. We have fact checking at the New Yorker. Every piece that appears on the New Yorker website is fact checked, and it's a lot of time and effort that goes into these efforts. We don't always get it right. We make mistakes. Our columnists lean in different directions politically, but there is a process to it that we follow as journalists.
Yeah, that was an amazing experience for me the first time I did a magazine piece, and I got a call from the fact checkers who basically I thought were re-reporting it. Who did you talk to? When did you talk to them? What did they tell you? And then they would call these people up and say, did he really say that?
Yeah, no, that's an unusual thing about the New Yorker, that if you do an interview with the journalist, they write the story, and then you have a separate phone call with a fact checker who calls you up and says, okay, this is what the journalist says. The gist of your quote is this. I'm calling you separately. If you want to contradict what the reporter is planning to write, let me know. So it's a unique system, but it costs money to have fact checkers, and that's why subscriptions are so important. And again, subscribe to Wall Street Journal, subscribe to conservative, news organizations. I'm not saying who you should subscribe to, but if you want quality journalism from the left or the right, it helps to pay for it, because that gives people time to do really in-depth investigative reporting that we really need from both sides of the political spectrum.
Well, I can tell you, it certainly keeps a journalist on their toes. I once got a call from the managing editor saying, so-and-so says you didn't ever talk to them. I don't know if there's a quote wrong, but you never talked to them. I want photocopies of every page in your notebook. I thought, whoa.
No, it's having a correction is still an embarrassing thing.
So talk to me about the Federalist Society, which you mentioned in the book. It's a question from Dory Crenshaw, one of our members of our audience. What about the Federalist Society? Barr has been involved in that along with many others. Aren't they the ultimate deep state, says this questioner, given their hold on the judiciary nominations?
Well, I think, this is where I would say I disagree. I think that they are a conservative legal organization. That they do produce many of the nominees that have been appointed by Republican presidents, and they've produced very, very large numbers of the people President Trump has appointed. There are public hearings. There's an argument that judges on Federalist Society, and I guess they would argue this on the left too, that they're now very careful about what they say in public throughout their careers, that if you want to make it to the federal bench, you basically keep your cards close to your vest. And so then when these hearings happen, there's kind of nothing to stop the nominations from coming through. But I would say, again, I would say, if you're liberal, accept Robert Mueller's finding that there is not proof that Trump colluded with Russia, And unless there's, illegal activity that's found by the Federalist Society, I would say that's it's a very successful conservative legal organization. I haven't seen any allegations that anything they're doing, is illegal.
A question here from one of our very active council members, Ray Termini, who says he wants to take us back to Comey. And after Trump fired Comey, he admitted that he had later realized that he had relayed his accounts of his interactions with the president to a friend, who then in turn shared it with a New York Times reporter. What's your thoughts about the way Comey's behaved in all this?
So this is back to this, definition of a whistleblower versus someone who's just maliciously leaking for political gain. If I'm getting this right, what he leaked was that the conversation where Trump, according to Comey, said go easy on Michael Flynn, the national security advisor who had lied to FBI agents about his phone call with the Russian ambassador. Comey said he leaked that information because it was evidence of the president trying to obstruct, justice, to obstruct that information. So if I can't get in Comey's head, and I'm a journalist, I want leaks of the president, of the United States obstructing an investigation, a legally justified investigation. What I think is wrong that Comey's done, and what many FBI agents, I don't even know their political persuasions. Most FBI agents told me they don't want to be involved in politics. They want to go kick down doors and arrest bad guys. But, he is so, I think it doesn't help the FBI as an institution to have Jim Comey out there, telling people to vote against Donald Trump and being so openly partisan. Again, Comey and Brennan, they're retired. They have a right to, First Amendment right to speak, but having, former career FBI and CIA officials being overtly political doesn't help the institutions. And so I'm more critical of that behavior than that leak of the conversation allegedly about Flynn.
So talk to me about, here's a question from, let me see if I can find this. Do you think the impeachment process of the president was carried out properly? This is an anonymous question.
It's a great question. I think that the Republicans' questions and wanting more hearings of their own in the House was fair. That the Democrats kind of had their hearings that they wanted to, and the Republicans should have had more of a round that went on. On the flip side, so I think that the Democrats controlled the impeachment process and the hearings and the witnesses and that kind of stuff. On the flip side, the president obstructed the impeachment investigation. What did Mick Mulvaney know, when? John Bolton should have testified as part of the impeachment investigation. There are records of, when the hold was put on the money from Ukraine. There was all kinds of evidence that was suppressed by the White House. So look, I think neither side was perfect in this. But then a president has never before dismissed the Congress's right to carry out an impeachment against him and get material. But look, one of the characters in the book is Will Hurd, Texas congressman, former CIA officer, served on the Intelligence Committee, had to vote on impeachment. He was very critical of Adam Schiff. There's a specific thing where what Republicans told me was that Democrats knew there was not evidence of, I'm so impressed with the preparation of this council and these pictures that you're pulling up, that Democrats knew, members who had access to the intelligence information knew that there was not definitive evidence of collusion between Trump and Russia, yet they kept it in the headlines for months and months. Hurd was specifically angry at Adam Schiff, saying that at one point Schiff said there was beyond circumstantial evidence of collusion. That never came out, or Robert Mueller never found it. Anyway, but this is our gulf that we exist in terms of the impeachment. Will Hurd, he said he thought that the call with Ukraine's president was amateurish. I had other conservatives say they agree that Trump was sort of unorthodox, but Hurd basically felt it wasn't an impeachable offense. But on the other side of the spectrum, and I've talked to Adam Schiff for this book also, he's receiving multiple death threats. He sees Donald Trump silencing intelligence officials who, even dare contradict the talking point the president's made. And, Adam Schiff, I think sincerely, so Will Hurd, I think sincerely does not see the president as, an authoritarian, and a dire threat to the country. On the other hand, Adam Schiff, I think sincerely believes that Donald Trump is a threat to the future of American democracy, and that he's concentrating power in the presidency in a way that goes beyond even what Nixon did. You're muted.
Sorry, we've had some questions about the media, and looking at some organizations that have seems to be more viewers than even the New Yorker, Fox, MSNBC, CNN.
A lot more.
Average combined audience of 6 million primetime viewers. Half of US adults, perhaps 100 million or more, get their news from social media, such as Facebook and Twitter. To what degree have these outlets, with their 24-hour coverage, commentary, insularity, and occasional disinformation, to what degree have they influenced American politics?
Enormously. And this will, and I'm the New Yorker guy who has a smaller audience and writes books. Fox News made nearly $1 billion in profit last year. I think made over $1 billion. I think MSNBC was nearly $1 billion. CNN is somewhere there also. The most extreme and most partisan commentators on both networks, on the right and the left, make millions and millions of dollars every year, getting up there and just laying it out and giving you a kind of overly simplified version of, the president is the greatest or the president is the worst. And, I got to improve my tone here. That's their right. Again, if they can get an audience, God bless them. But I think that the growth of kind of cable news, the partisan echo chamber thing, is corrosive to our democracy. We need more kind of basic, straight down the middle reporting. That doesn't make as much money. That costs money. It takes, you have an investigative unit and they spend 6 to 12 months on a story. It's much cheaper. One of the reasons you don't see camera crews out, you see them in hurricanes, but you see less and less TV reporters going out and flying to a location and going to, Peoria, Illinois, and talking to people in Peoria, Illinois about what they think, because that's expensive. So yes. These networks are making huge profits, could be doing more and more basic reporting, but it's much cheaper to put an anchor in a chair and bring in commentators. And I was a CNN commentator. I'm now an MSNBC commentator, contributor. I want to disclose that and be honest, but I try to be more measured in what I say. I probably fail sometimes, but, so again, read the Wall Street Journal, read those newspaper stories, the Dallas Morning News or whatever, you want to read, and if, there's more rigorous reporting, I think, going on there than you see on many, not all, but on many cable news.
Let's talk about journalism, print journalism, among other things. The president's often cast media as the enemy, even the enemy of the people. He portrays it as a biased source of opinion disguised as reportage or maybe opinion disguised as analysis. But shortly before he was elected, the top editor of one of the most respected publications in the world, the New York Times, predicted that a Trump presidency will have changed journalism. Has it?
It has. And look, the president, people want to say Donald Trump's, mentally unstable and kind of mock him. He is an extraordinarily effective political communicator, and he's extremely good at messaging. He's very consistent about it. So, deep state, I think, is a pejorative term that's used to discredit, findings that the president doesn't like. Fake news has successfully kind of discredited the media in many people's eyes. Witch hunt was something he used effectively to, try to discredit in some people's eyes, the Mueller investigation. But I think that most journalists, aren't doing that. They're not making up their sources. And I think that it's corrosive and confusing to people. And again, we see this in coronavirus. we have to believe, so this kind of winner-take-all politics, and you can argue Democrats are doing the same thing, but if we just discredit institutions over and over, judges, journalists, medical officials, it leads to this kind of paralysis or this chaos where we need to, have some basic facts we all agree on. The media needs to try to play it straight, or to play it straight, so that people will have more confidence in us. Anyway, the president, it's a strategy. He uses these terms and conspiracy theories to discredit other sources of information, rival sources of information, and then he's simultaneously being less transparent about what his White House and his sort of inner circle is doing, and he is succeeding. It's a strategy, and people should, like it or dislike it, but he is doing it. He is very effective, and he is succeeding.
David, I spent a lot of time avoiding one of the major topics in your book. You have mentioned several attorneys general, from Bobby Kennedy to William Barr, but none get the attention you devote to Barr, whose name appears more than 300 times in the book. That's about a third as many mentions as you make of President Trump. Why so much emphasis on Barr?
Because of his lifelong adherence, into this belief that the presidency was weakened during Watergate, that the creation of inspectors general and special prosecutors, the fact that the Congress has some oversight of the CIA's covert action programs, he rejects. I mean, he says that it's very clear from Article 2 of the Constitution that the president runs the executive branch. There was a memo he written before he was named Attorney General arguing that if the president sort of suborned perjury, asked someone to lie, or destroyed evidence, that would be obstruction of justice. But firing the FBI director or firing Comey is not obstruction of justice. Firing an FBI director, if the president fires the FBI director who's investigating him, that's not obstruction of justice for Bill Barr, because the president has that power. And, Barr believes, he gave this in a Federalist Society speech, that we need a strong presidency, that if you look at American history, it's the executive branch, the president, that saved the country in moments of crisis, wars, pandemics, and that, the legislative branch is too divided and clumsy to act. Judiciary doesn't even have, the staff and the agencies to carry out. So Barr has believed this for decades. Now it comes along and he's helping Donald Trump. And I think he does believe it, but people are saying that Trump is taking it too far, that Barr is taking it too far, and that, there's a line in the end of my book that, under the guise of stopping a coup that doesn't exist, Trump, is upending the balance between the three branches of government. And I'm not saying if Barr is right or wrong, but this moment is an amazing, civics lesson in American democracy. Do we want three co-equal branches of government that are cumbersome? The court throws out, Trump's travel ban from predominantly Muslim countries. Barr says that's wrong. Is that right? If there's a Democratic president, is it right that, when Obama was president, Mitch McConnell could kind of stonewall things he wanted to get through Congress? Do we want our cumbersome, slow, divided system, or do we need a stronger presidency? This is these are the core questions of American democracy.
As we approach the end of our session here, let me get some thoughts about the response of the president to the coronavirus plague. Did the president respond soon enough? Has his response been appropriate? Is it consistent?
So I don't know. There's been reporting that the president was slow to listen to the warnings from health officials in January and February. That's just reporting from the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post. And he has, as I mentioned, Dr. Fauci, a lot of attacks on Fauci, but Trump has generally supported him. What is concerning is that earlier this week, Rick Bright, he's a top infectious disease expert,
Right.
He had questioned the use of, I'm getting it wrong, chloroquine, the anti-malaria drug. And he was removed from his position. And there was, a lot of criticism of this. This is one of the people who's going to help us come out of this pandemic, is going to help us with testing and help us reopen the economy. And he's fired because he questions this cure the president has been pushing. So I think the firing of Bright is not productive. The president, maybe the president again, is a victim of the president needs to have a circle of advisors that he trusts. He can't know everything about infectious diseases and North Korea's nuclear program, the economy and education. And so he needs a group around him that he trusts, or he has to start trusting some of these government officials. I think he's doing it now. But the question is, it was a very bad side so it's a mixed record. I think that, we could have had testing sooner. Whose fault that is, it's not clear. Hey, there should be a big 9/11 style commission about coronavirus, nonpartisan, and let's get some facts on the table. And I think that would serve the American public well.
And I'm sure there will be. David, if President Trump wins a second term, what do you foresee for American democracy and for a system of checks and balances?
Just a quick version is I hope he wins decisively. I think another electoral college victory will be really divisive for the country. There is a sense among some public servants of a kind of frustration with our political system. Tom O'Connor, I'm going to try to do the quick version, a career FBI agent, major character in the book, joins just before 9/11, goes to the USS Cole after it's attacked in Yemen, recovers the bodies of those sailors, goes to the Pentagon after 9/11. He and other FBI agents collect more than 2,000 bags of human remains. He goes to Iraq and investigates the Blackwater security guards that shot civilians in a traffic circle in Baghdad. He comes back to the U.S. and investigates, racial extremist groups. So he retired on 9/11 this year. He was at the hearing where all the first responders wanted more funding from Congress. And, he felt, and a lot of the career folks I talked to, feel that the political class is out of control, the media is out of control. And I asked, Tom O'Connor, well, now you're retired, would you want to run for Congress and, clean up this mess? And Tom O'Connor said, no way, I want to do something that actually has meaning. That's a bad sign for American democracy. So I think our political class, journalists, we all need to try to turn it down a few notches and try to agree on some basic facts instead of this sort of endless scorched earth political war.
David, thank you. And on that happy note, let me turn it back to Jim Falk.
Sorry.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I do look forward to reading your book. The title of the book is In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. And as I say, you can pick that up today. I think you can actually go to Interabang and pick it up on the curb. Let me also thank our good friend Don Crook for supporting today's program. Again, thank you, David and Richard. Thank you to all of you listening. Have a very nice weekend.